Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry we're in of writing and self-publishing. And today we're delighted to have a very special guest, Jeanne Blasberg, a novelist, essayist, and reviewer, who I'm going to call Jeannie because I love that, with your permission. We are delighted to have you on the show. How are you doing today, Jeannie?
I'm doing great, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks, Roland, and thanks, Jeannie, for coming on today. I know, you've written some books, and one of them is Daughter of a Promise, which is a modern retelling of a biblical story. And so what we're looking today to talk about is sort of that idea of, retelling classic stories in another way. And a lot of authors do this. And, we want to dive into sort of the reasons why we do it and what the benefits are. Because I know, in romance, I often see there'll be retellings of a lot of fairy tales like Beauty and the Beast, sometimes Little Red Riding Hood is written as sort of a romance. Other times I've seen sort of some books that are sort of outside of copyright have started to sort of become retold as well. Pride and Prejudice, I know, is one of the ones that you see a lot of now, right? There was a big movie a few years back, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. So I think a lot of people are sort of taking that and rehashing stuff. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your writing and sort of how you got into this sort of idea of retelling stuff?
So Craig, I'm so excited to speak on this topic. I mean, kind of solely this during this show, because I feel like I could talk about it forever. There's a lot of reasons why my novels draw from ancient texts and are basically retellings. And I think, in addition to the ones you mentioned, you see a lot of novels that are drawn from mythology, even performance art, Broadway shows, Hadestown, things that are really drawing from our culture's mythical stories. And you mentioned fairy tales. I would say fairy tales really rank in there with our culture's myths. There's certain archetypes in our culture, and there's certain plots and storylines, which we all have in our DNA, whether it's Little Red Riding Hood or Cinderella or the story of Adam and Eve, or in the case of the case of Daughter of a Promise, my latest novel, it's this love story between David, the powerful king of Israel, and Bathsheba, an unsuspecting, beautiful woman that he spots from his rooftop. And in my novel, I'll just speak to that specifically, and I think it holds true in general, is that it was written in a time when the man's point of view and this love affair had an impact on his life, and that's the way the story was originally written. It never was really written in the Bible, at least, in a way that would reveal Bathsheba's feelings, her reactions. I don't want to spoil anything, but for those people who haven't read the original story, it's quite tragic some of the things that happen to her along the way, as she becomes involved with this powerful man. Yet the story really focuses on David's life. So I think in a lot of modern retellings, the author has this amazing opportunity to recontextualize, to create a different protagonist as the main character, somebody who wasn't necessarily the main character or didn't have a voice in the original. Even if you think of like the Broadway hit Hamilton, it's not necessarily a retelling, but there's so much fun in creating a different cast of characters than what you might originally have, how you might imagine our founding fathers. So I think authors can start with this very established structure of a plot that most people are somewhat familiar with, even if they've not read the Bible. The idea of young woman, an older man, older, powerful man, and he kind of makes her his own and locks her in a castle. That kind of goes back to like the 18th century Gothic prototype. But anyway, people are fairly familiar with where this might be heading, but then you get to surprise them with your own interpretation. And maybe just like with my novel, Bathsheba, or as she's called in my novel, Betsabe, she does something a little bit unsuspected. She has agency and power that she doesn't get to have in the way the original text was written.
Oh, that's fascinating. I did. So I went to a theological college, so I'm always interested in how women were kind of like erased from the gospel of the gospel Bible, you know. I find that a really interesting perspective to take.
Well, thanks. I mean, I think my inspiration was really, I converted to Judaism about 20 years ago, and part of the conversion process involves a good deal of study. And I continued the study in a group with my temple, a group of women we meet every month, led by our senior rabbi. And we really delve into kind of the white spaces of the text. So there's the words that are written in black ink, but there's the spaces between where there's so many questions, because causality is an issue in the Bible, just as it is in fairy tales. Like this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. But in literature and in modern storytelling, you're like, but why would that happen? Didn't she question it? Didn't she resist? Didn't she think, no way am I going to do this? So anyway, this group, the study group, we take part in an ancient tradition called midrash, which is a verb as well as a noun. So the canon of writings by the rabbis who kind of fill in the blanks, that goes back thousands of years, and it's always been called rabbinic midrash. But anybody can midrash in terms of the verb, and it means to pull out. And it means to pull out and answer questions, and maybe, just like I said, recontextualize with the woman as the main character.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really powerful things about being able to take this story that so many people are familiar with and give it another point of view that people haven't often thought about, you know, that you start to, with the story of Little Red Riding Hood, I've seen the story told from the wolf's point of view, right? So it's like, yeah, it gives people another way of thinking about a story that they've sort of grown up with, and sometimes that can like blow their mind.
Yeah, and just to jump in again, in addition to recontextualizing and showing a different point of view, I'm a real believer that things haven't changed that much when it comes to human relationships. And so one reason I also like to retell stories and set them in a contemporary setting is because it also blows your mind that some power dynamic in a relationship thousands of years ago is still kind of the same thing we're dealing with. So I both get to show a different point of view, but also show the timelessness of some of these issues. The love affair between David and Bathsheba has long been debated. Was it consensual? Was he taking advantage of her? Was she on the roof bathing because she wanted to be noticed? It's always been this area, this gray area among the rabbis as to whether it was an appropriate relationship and whether it really marks the downfall of David's judgment or not. And I thought that was such a modern topic, because as I was thinking about it, we were watching a lot of powerful men be outed with Me Too accusations, and it just felt like this was the biblical Me Too story, in a way. I mean, I took a bit of a light touch, but this is the first novel I wrote where I really paralleled the story to a great degree. My second novel is called The Nine, and I use the story of Hannah and Samuel as kind of a launching pad. But with Daughter of a Promise, my characters resemble and resemble many of the characters in the original story, and the plot parallels in a lot of ways, in kind of cute, tricky ways, not like there's a war in the Bible, and in my book, the war is kind of getting sent off to this distant office during COVID, which kind of is a death sentence in and of itself. So, you know, I've made modern interpretations, but yeah, I feel like some, to be able to read an ancient text and see things really haven't changed. To me, it's both despairing and also comforting. I mean, if we're not doing quite the job we'd like as human beings, it's comforting to know that most human beings have failed throughout our species' existence. And then yet there's a little disappointment that the status of women hasn't risen to a better station with regard to their womb and their ability to control their bodies and have more control in relationships or in a patriarchal system. So
I find that fascinating. So your stories are set in the modern day.
Yeah.
What an interesting thing. There was one movie I saw called Chirac, which was the story of Lysistrata back in ancient Greece, except brought to Chicago in the modern day. And I find it so fascinating that you took something from the Bible and then brought it to the modern day, and then yet those same parallels between that. So what an incredible, like, an inspirational. And I guess the reason these stories have remained throughout history and remain relevant to people is perhaps because of the white spaces where, you know, people can read them, women can read them and see themselves in the blank spaces and write the parts that aren't written or got censored.
Yeah, well, hopefully they can, but the risk is that they don't see themselves in the actual text, and they don't have the imagination to see themselves in the white spaces, and they feel like the text is irrelevant. So I think making these stories somewhat your own and having the imagination that can transfer an ancient story into a modern situation or into a personal situation is something I want to offer people, you know, the encouragement to think that way. Everything was written with the worldview that the author had when they were writing it. And we have a much more liberal, maybe a different worldview. And so we're able to write and expand in ways. But yeah, for example, just like the contemporary setting. So my second novel, The Nine, Hannah in the Bible had fertility issues and couldn't conceive. And her husband had another wife who had all these babies, and she was feeling very second class and very sad. And she went to the temple and prayed for a child or for a pregnancy. And the priest overheard her praying and thought she was so like fervent in her prayers. He accused her of being drunk. And she prayed that if she were to become pregnant with a son, she would hand him over once he was weaned to the temple and let him be raised to serve God. And so my modern day interpretation is this hovering helicopter mother who is having a hard time conceiving, and she turns her son, and the definition of weaned is a little bit older than you might think, but she turns him over to a very prestigious boarding school and this headmaster who she thinks will be the golden ticket to her son's future. But things don't turn out quite the way she imagined. So it has to just really do with like a mother-son relationship, and it has to do with trust, and that trust that mothers have when they turn their children over, you know, even to go to kindergarten, to go out, to just leave the house for the first time and kind of go out into the world. So yeah, so that novel kind of takes off and becomes this boarding school campus novel with a scandal and all sorts of running through tunnels and crazy stuff. But yeah, this latest one, Daughter of a Promise, is set on Wall Street. So my young heroine, Betsabe, is in an investment banking analyst training program. And David is the head of M&A and kind of the rainmaker at the firm. And they notice each other, and there is chemistry right from the beginning. So there's a little bit of a love triangle if people know the original story. But yeah, that's there's a 30-year age difference. So both in terms of power, wealth, and age, there's quite a disparity between these two. Yet when COVID comes down, they do sequester together, and that gives them a little bit of shade so that this love affair can take off.
I find that fascinating as well, taking that setup and then putting real life modern things to it. I find like putting COVID into books is a really interesting thing. Most authors, when they write, just pretend COVID never happened. And there are a few. We had Raymond Benson on, and he wrote a COVID novel that was set during COVID, and COVID was a vital part of the plot. And it's so interesting for you to take this biblical story set in the modern day, but then absolutely like carbon date it with COVID.
Yeah, I felt like that was the perfect situation to allow this kind of relationship to incubate, because otherwise there would be he would have been fired and she would have been found out. And I mean, I even thought back, there was I don't know, there was a Me Too situation. I think it was the head of someone at CNN and a person who worked for him. And one of the explanations for why the relationship bonded was because they got extremely close during COVID. And I was just like, exactly, like all rules were off the table during COVID. It's funny, when I went back to revise the novel and do a lot of editing, part of that timeline was almost too raw with what was going on during COVID, because I was drafting during COVID. And so the day-to-day, like the domestic craziness we were living with was really imbued in the novel. I left a lot of it in, but I had to take a good deal of it out. It almost detracted from the plot and brought back a little bit too much PTSD.
Like, I mean, it's kind of crazy to think in a few years we were like talking about how we used to wash our groceries when we came home.
Okay, when people already talk about that and say, was I really doing that?
Yeah.
You know, I find it from a technical perspective, you know, the one question that I have is, when you're retelling these stories, and I imagine that, you know, there's not one right answer, but when you're retelling these stories, do you need it to be made clear to the audience that you are retelling these stories, or are you sort of leaving it for them to just sort of read it and sort of realize that this is a retelling of that story?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I would say with my first two novels, and even though the first novel was named Eden, 99% of the readers that I interacted with were dumbstruck when I suggested there was a retelling of an ancient text. What I did with the 9 and also with this is that I actually quote, and it's not a very long verse, but it's basically the meat of the biblical story, and it's my epigraph, and it's right there just before chapter 1, from a quote from the book of Samuel. So if you were to read that, you'd be like, I wonder why she's quoting that part of the Bible. At least with Daughter of a Promise, the reviews have pointed to the fact that it's a modern retelling. But you know what? You don't have to know that this is a Bible story. I think actually, if you don't know that, and then you may become aware of it later, you'll go back and say, oh, but that was such a crazy plot. That couldn't have been in the Bible. David would have gone through all those steps to try to hide the pregnancy. And like, are you kidding me? That was actually what was written in the Bible. So anyway, I don't really get into that. And also for commercial reasons, I think I was told by people, don't mention religion, don't mention the Bible. You know, people might make assumptions that it's maybe not in a contemporary setting, or that it's got religious overtones.
Right.
I really see the Old Testament and the Jewish Bible as a great piece of literature. And so just like people do retellings of Shakespeare or ancient mythology, I just view it as an ancient text. I guess the I wanted to just not forget to say one last thing about why it's really fun to do retellings. And I think it's because it provides like this structure that the story already kind of has a plot and a structure. And so the fun is how to make it contemporary and relevant. And it's not so much what an author goes through with like, how do I close this thing? What's going to happen? Or, I decide when I wanted to end the story and what state of mind my Bathsheba was going to be in, which I think is the surprising conclusion. But it's really very fun to already work with a framework and figure out how you're going to make it your own.
Right, and I guess the question sort of becomes for people is, if you're changing too much of it, then it's almost like not a retelling, right? But so if your ending was different than the story you're retelling, are people going to be sort of like disappointed by that, or will they expect that the retelling should be sort of true to the original in that sense?
Yeah, well, A Daughter of a Promise ends at a point in time where Bathsheba can do a number of things with the rest of her life. And if you were to read the Bible, what she ultimately does, but I think it's very empowering to show her at a point in time where she has choices. And if she chooses to stay with David, it's because she's choosing to, and he needs her more than she needs him at that point. And yeah, the future that they'll have going forward, she's a 50-50 partner. It's not a, like I've been rescued, or I'm a damsel in distress, or I'm Little Red Riding Hood who's been saved by the great huntsman. I actually refer to Little Red Riding Hood a lot in my novel as well. It's an ending point at which the reader would be like, yeah, I give her a lot of credit. Like, she's actually the main character in this story, not David.
Which is, I guess it's always interesting. Whoever reads the story rewrites the story decides who the main character is. And
yep. And in this book, we're in the first person, so we're in her head. It's a retrospective, so she's 23 while the action is happening, but she's probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years older when she's telling the actual story. And in my novel, she's telling it in the form of a letter to her unborn son, Sol. And she's Cuban American. So, the Spanish translation of Sol would be sun, the most fiery star in the sky. And she's named her child in utero Sol, and she's writing to him. But a person who's aware of the story would say, oh, Sol, that's very similar to Solomon. And so her child she has when she's actually married to David is named Solomon, and he becomes the next king, and his mantle is the one of wisdom. And so my inference here is that Solomon does not get all of his wisdom from God as it's written in the Bible, but probably gets a good deal of his wisdom from his mother.
Don't we all?
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, there's I guess a tradition that the father hands down discipline and the mother hands down wisdom. And so I'm playing with that idea as well.
Right. The other thing I was thinking about too was, the idea of how you mentioned, like how we have this different worldview now, right? And a lot of times in the news, even lately, you hear about books that were written long ago that are now being sort of banned, or they're being censored because our worldview has changed from what it was when those books were written. And as authors, we're usually against that sort of thing, the idea of censorship. We're telling it's a story that was written at a point in time, and by not looking at that or telling people they can't look at that anymore, it's sort of like it's trying to erase history, right? But I wonder if this is sort of another way to keep those stories alive, but you recontextualize them and tell them in more modern times where things have changed and evolved. That might be something that people could do instead of banning these books.
Yeah, exactly. You can, even in your own retelling be a little tongue-in-cheek, and if you can elegantly refer to the original text, point to how you're taking a different tact. I really, really love the idea, and I don't want to be like presumptuous, but I love the idea of writing something that's in conversation with something else. It adds a certain amount of heft and, I guess, like intelligence to the work. And so just like you were saying, Craig, to be referring to like the next version of something, to be like the Little Red Riding Hood 2.0, or to be taking something that may be viewed now as sexist or racist or anyist, and putting a different spin on it, as opposed to completely trashing the original. It's we're all evolving, and our how we consider the world is evolving. Our world is so connected. Our understanding of humans and people and where things come from is always evolving. So being in conversation with works that came before, I think, is like such an amazing thing. To think that my work could be in relation or thought of in relation to biblical texts or takes on retellings or mythology or fairy tales, I find that to be really satisfying. Just from an artistic point of view, because so much about being an indie author, it's not so, like, what's my view or my definition of success? It's like achieving an artistic goal has to be what my definition of success is. It's not necessarily going to be in copies sold, but maybe it is. But it's also like in who takes notice and having these really exciting conversations and getting to talk about things like this. This is so interesting. I'm actually teaching a couple classes this spring on making ancient texts your own and retellings. And so I think everybody has the opportunity to make the past relevant in their own work. And I think that's really like a motivating force for why I write.
A couple of years ago, I was just going to say, a couple of years ago, they had a wonderful TV show called Lovecraft Country, which was an African-American retelling of the Lovecraft stories, because H.P. Lovecraft, as influential as he was known as a racist. And it's that's a fascinating thing, where the people who used to be the target of his discrimination now do this wonderful and relevant retelling of those stories.
I love that. I haven't seen those, but that's a great tip. I'm going to look them up.
Yeah, and I that's kind of what I was going to say, is that, I hate the idea of we have these great stories that are part of our collective history, human history, and that, because the author did something separate than the book, we now can't read that book, or there was something in the book that at the time was acceptable, but now we realize it was wrong, so the whole book is garbage. Like, I don't agree with that. Like, you can separate out the issues from the story, and the idea that you could retell the story to fix those issues sometimes, or to put it in a different context than what that person was or did, like that Lovecraft example, right? You can say, okay, so this person was a racist, but that doesn't mean that we can enjoy those stories. And here, let's tell these stories from the perspective of the people that he was racist against. I think that's a wonderful idea.
Yeah. I mean,
so what's the class that you teach on this?
Oh, well, it's not an actual class. I'm going to, well, it's a class, but it's at a writers conference. So the Muse in the Marketplace Writers Conference is put on by Grub Street, which is a creative writing center in Boston. And in the spring, they always have their big conference called the Muse in the Marketplace. And I'm teaching a session called Making Ancient Text Your Own. And then I'm potentially teaching the same class at a writers conference in Park City later in the summer. but I'm writing a lot on this topic because, as you know, in advance of a publication date, there's a lot of content you're putting out. And so I'm constantly writing on why biblical women inspire me, why I'm going back and doing retellings. And I think I just wrote a piece for Electric Lit that's going to come out and talk about and refer to other retellings, and all biblical retellings. So from The Color Purple to the Prophets, to the Book of Ruth, and a few other, like East of Eden by John Steinbeck. So some real classics, and then some other more contemporary works of fiction. Marilyn Robinson is also someone I love, and she does a very light, well, not a light touch, but she's relating more to the New Testament, but and the Christian Bible. But her work I find really inspiring. Always have.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't have to be only biblical, but that is such a rich story, like a rich piece of literature, regardless of your religious feelings about it. There's so many stories in there, and I think most books, if you drill down deep enough, you could probably say that's a retelling of a biblical story.
Yeah, and so many Civil War books, or so many books about the American slave experience, I think you always think of a reference to Exodus, and they are, and some of the books that I'm talking about in my roundup obviously do, and that's just a reference that is easy or a parallel that's easy to make.
Right, and I think that as more books sort of come out of copyright, and as the years go by, there's even more opportunity for people. I think that's one of the reasons why Pride and Prejudice became such a big one, is that it moved out of copyright, and then everyone sort of jumped on that. Not just for, I mean, sometimes people did it just for the idea of being associated with that. And if you put Pride and Prejudice in the title, then, and those ones are very explicit about it, right? They're saying this is Pride and Prejudice, whereas that other sort of way of going about it is you're telling the story, but you're not really saying that this is a retelling of that story.
Or there's so many great jumping offs, like Ahab's Wife is a great jumping off from Moby Dick. And most recently I read Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which is basically like what was going on with Shakespeare's wife and his kids. I mean, it's taking and Maggie O'Farrell does this a lot in her work. There'd be a very well-known man, and you're now when I refer to the white space is like, what was going on in his domestic life? What was his wife like? What's the story behind when he wrote Hamlet? Like, why did he write that? And so those aren't necessarily retellings, but anything that's like questioning, like is answering the questions that come up from the original work. I'll use that word midrash, but I think retellings they can be done with a light touch, and they are just inspirations from like an original work or an original point in history, a time when a lot of voices might have been quieted or not considered. And I love the whole genre of work that's coming about that's filling in the pieces. And I think there's this new genre really called fan fiction, right? So people are looking at novels they love, and then they're writing their own riff on it or their own extension of it. It's prequels and sequels. I think it's that whole idea of being in conversation with a greater work, and trying to artistically like commune with other great thinkers. I think that's such a fun part of being a writer.
And sometimes authors even do it sort of to themselves. Like I think back to one of the first I was always a fan of science fiction and fantasy. One of the first great science fiction books that I read growing up was, Orson Scott Card, Speaker for the Dead, and Ender's Game, those ones. And so those ones, Ender's Game came out first. It won the Hugo and the Nebula, and then The Speaker for the Dead came out like a year or two later, and it won the Hugo and the Nebula, which was, unprecedented at the time. And then he wrote a few more books. But then what he did was he went back and he sort of almost started over again, but told the same story from the point of view of one of the secondary characters, which is sort of what we're talking about. But he's used his own work to do that, where he just went again and sort of almost rewrote Ender's Game from the story from the point of view of Bean, one of his sort of friends. And it's a really interesting way of retelling the same story, but having it completely different, because it's seen from a whole different perspective with events that are very familiar to you if you've read the original books. So it's that idea of keeping everything sort of familiar, but being able to really dive deep and tell a different story within that same.
Yeah, so I'm having to look this up real quick because I have such, I'm having a senior moment, but Olive Kittredge and Elizabeth Strout. Oh my God, I pulled it out of the air. Okay, she is one of my favorite authors, but from Olive Kittredge, she's that won the Pulitzer Prize. She's drawn out minor characters, and those are the main characters in several of her next novels and short stories. And same with Marilyn Robinson. She started with this town of Gilead, and we continue and similar themes. I don't want to put myself in the same space as those amazing women, but I do share in my 3 novels, setting and characters overlap a little bit. So I kind of focus on this privileged life in my first book, Eden, of a Rhode Island summer community, which is kind of a reflection on what is paradise. And in the boarding school novel that I referred to, my main character spends a summer in that summer community. And then in my 3rd novel, Daughter of a Promise, Betsabe's friend from college who's in her training program is a boy who went to the boarding school, and also her roommate is a baby that was born at the very end of Eden. So I feel like these 3 novels, I like the idea of my readers having fun Easter eggs that they can discover in the next book. But I also like the idea of I've created this one imaginary world. I really want to just keep expanding it, but show different situations. And each of them are similar in that it's a very there's a privileged situation, but I'm showing the seedy underbelly, kind of the people who are getting screwed, as opposed to the really powerful people. It's more of the outsider's view of these situations than kind of the insider steward of that way of life. It's more the person who's showing up and kind of getting.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of cool that you've sort of created your own. It's sort of you've married these 2 ideas of you've created your own fictional universe, but you've also been able to have these story retellings within it, and so you've sort of taken that idea of retelling classic stories and in modern times and giving your own perspective on it, and you've been able to weave those all together into a world that is interconnected in its own.
Well, thanks, Craig. I think it's symptomatic of the fact that I take a really long time to write my novels. And so with each revision, I'm like, wow, what if I did this? What if I made it like this? And so you get this sense of, oh my gosh, did she mean to do all this? And I think people, my first novel took almost 12 years and was very ambitious. The second one, 6, this one about 4 or 5, but with each iteration, I get another idea of how to make it really relevant and really cool and relate to other things. And so it's a slow bake that it takes, I think, if you're going to add some complexity. And I don't care if my readers don't get all of it. It's the joy was in the writing of it. And then sometimes what's fun when I go to a book club and I talk about maybe the strands of this woven piece that didn't really resonate with them. It's fun to have people kind of rediscover things in the works that they've read, and they'd be like, oh, I'm gonna have to read that again. I didn't follow that at all. I now I see it, but that was not like, I was not. So I'm not really banging anyone over the head with any of these things, but they're all there if it kind of is your thing.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to authors, especially if they are thinking about, doing a retelling. Some authors might be like, okay, well, maybe I don't want to write a one-off book, but there are ways to sort of integrate. You could still do a retelling, but integrate it into a world if you've already sort of created them and you have an interconnected world, which a lot of authors do, or a series. You could work a retelling into a part of a series that you already have ongoing and sort of blend that in. So it's not like an either or situation. You can combine them.
Yeah. And the act of retelling, by definition, is that you've got a point of view on this original story. But in the just because you're retelling it, just by that fact alone, it might cause people to go back and reconsider what's the original story. And you don't necessarily have to have a heavy hand of like editorializing or commentary. It's you can be very subtle and nuanced, and just the very fact alone that I'm retelling David and Bathsheba, that should say something. And I don't need to be heavy-handed about the feminism part of it. And that, so I kind of like that as well. I let some of the original work do some of the work for me.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you don't have to tell people that it is a retelling. You can let them figure that out, and if they don't, then they enjoy it for what it is. I guess the only danger is if somebody comes out and says, "Oh, this is just a copy of this other story," right? And then they don't get that you were intentionally doing that. They think maybe you were just sort of like trying to pull one over on them. But
well, if you're retelling stories from the Old Testament that are hardly ever longer than one page, like 500 words, they cover a whole lot, and turn it into a 350-page novel, I think you're pretty safe there.
Yeah, we've added a little
bit.
There
are other retellings where I guess you need to be wary of just standing on someone else's work.
I mean, I don't think you'd have to like. I can see like there are TV shows that have an episode that's very clearly written quite quickly and copies something else almost verbatim or to a discussing brief. But most of the time, what you're doing is transforming this thing in a new and exciting way. So it's not really derivative, and part of I think the reason fan fiction, for example, is so popular is because you have established characters and situations everyone's familiar with, so you can cut right out and right down to the business of like, whatever is happening that the story is going to be about. And I think that's one of the huge advantages of taking like stories from popular myth, especially from like the Torah, and then retelling them.
Yeah. Sorry. Turn that off. I totally agree. I think, I'm one of these believers that there's probably 10 plots in the universe, and we are regurgitating them in all sorts of ways. And kind of the girl meets boy love story trope or archetype, people just come into this and they have their assumptions, right? And so you're all of a sudden poking at what those assumptions are and being provocative, turning things a slightly different way, and just your reader is coming to things with certain expectations because these plots are so under our skin. And so then when you do something surprising or you make choices, the fun in writing that is that you already anticipate what the interplay might be in someone else's mind, as opposed to just, we're not ever writing anything in a vacuum, whether we're retelling or not. There's just so many storylines, and we're all reading with an idea of where something's headed. And so if you're like a great writer who knows that, who can understand where your reader is thinking you're going, and then we're going somewhere else. That's, sort of a retelling in and of itself, because there's just not that many plots out there.
Well, you know what? That is a wonderful. We're nearly reaching the top of the hour, and that's like the natural segue to start wrapping things up. But what a fascinating discussion, Craig. Before we ask Jeanne where everyone can find out more about all her work and everything like that, do you have any final questions?
No, I mean, like I said, this was fascinating, and I love the idea of being able to sort of retell a story that people are already familiar with, but put your own sort of take on it, give your own perspective of it, maybe frame it in a way that is more relevant to the world that we now live in, as opposed to when it was written long ago, because it keeps that core of the story alive, right? And instead of having it die away because people say, it's not relevant anymore, or it talked about things that we shouldn't talk about now anymore. We don't have to ignore those things anymore. As writers, we can sort of massage them into something that's relevant again, and keep that the kernel that made it such a good story in the first place, keep that alive. So thanks for coming on and sort of giving us an idea of how to do that.
Oh, well, it was my pleasure. I mean, I really believe that our human relationships, wanting to be understood, wanting to be loved, not wanting to be abandoned, those are kind of the core elements of what we all live with and strive towards since the beginning of consciousness. And so I really do think that those things haven't changed. And like you said, Craig, some of the externalities have certainly changed, and some of and our worldview has certainly changed. But I love retellings because it's a reminder that at the core, we're all so similar and human in our humanness. But yeah, I'd love to continue the conversation further with people who want to find me. Is this when I should let you know how to do it?
Absolutely, yes. Tell us where people can find you.
I have a website which is called JeanneBlasberg.com. And I'm also very active on Instagram at Jeanne Blasberg Author. That's also my Facebook handle. And I've started to write. I think we started the hour by saying I write essays, but I do continue to post essays on my Substack page, which is also, you can search Jeanne Blasberg on Substack.
That's fantastic. Well, we'll of course pop a link down below. So if you're interested in finding out more about what Jeanne has written, then you can definitely scroll down and find that. While you're there, there's a big comment section. So make sure to leave Jeanne a comment and say how much you appreciated all of the wisdom she has shared today. While you're down there, there's also a subscribe button, a like button. There's little bell icons. You can click on that and get notified every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked. And until then, we'll be back next week with a brand new episode. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.